A lot of players seem to think that Magic's biggest problem is the lands. However, we have a bigger problem to talk about in Magic systems.
Are you going to talk about the pizza lands? Are we talking about the pizza lands? I didn't mind them. Look good.
Distraction makers.
So the bigger problem that we're going to be talking about with Magic is its activation system. So there's a great new channel. Sam Pearson from Warhammer. He's a games designer. Was a games designer at Games Workshop. His new YouTube channel is called SPDG, which stands for
GD.
GD. SPGD.
Yeah.
Which stands for Sam Pearson Game Design, I would imagine.
Or Sam Pearson. God damn. Sorry. Okay, I'm done. All right.
He has a video that he put out not that long ago about activation systems. You know, listening to his perspective on this was really enlightening, and I love a lot of the stuff that he was talking about. But for us, I think we define activation systems a little differently.
So we like to use the term interaction gap. Interaction gap basically meaning the amount of actions that one player can perform before their opponent can respond with their own actions.
And the reason why we look at it in this sort of framework, it's just a choice of number in between how many actions that you get to take versus until your opponent gets to do something. And the most extreme ends of that are you can take one action or you can take infinite actions or unlimited actions.
Right. And any number between there.
And then there's any number in between there and different ways for you to limit those actions.
So before we get too deep into it, we kind of have to re-explain sub-games that we've talked about on the channel before. So our definition of games generally is that they have meaningful decisions, uncertain outcome, and measurable results. And sub-games are essentially the shortest bit of a game that you can achieve that particular instance of those things occurring. And so the time that it takes for you to get from into the entirety of a subgame, right? To go from the beginning that has the uncertainty and has the meaningful decisions into the final results. That's oftentimes indicative of what the length of time of your interaction gap is.
If you have an interaction gap of one action, your input into your opponent's next action is just one action, right? If we think about chess for a minute, chess's interaction gap is a single action. You get to move one piece. Your opponent then moves one piece, but they're going to move their piece based on what piece you moved and how you moved it, right? That is an input into your opponent's next action. Now, if we have a much broader interaction gap, we might have a bunch of actions that we get to take before our opponent gets to take a bunch of their own actions.
Right. We'll get into all the different types of interaction gaps, and we'll have some examples of that. But first, let's sort of dive into what Magic's interaction gap looks like.
And Magic's is very unique. They actually have a spectrum, I guess, of interaction gaps. They have what I think the majority of new players perceive Magic to be, which is an unlimited interaction gap, meaning I get to take as many actions as I want, and then I pass the turn to my opponent. And I think that introducing players to a game in that way is a bit more friendly. It's easier to wrap your head around. But then Magic also has as small as one action interaction gap in its true systems, in that once you understand how the stack works, you realize that Magic is actually mostly, I guess, a game of alternating interactions, but only on a subset of cards and activated abilities, essentially.
Right. And this is the biggest hurdle for new players to sort of get over and understand, that whether you realize it or not, you're constantly existing within the stack, right? Anytime that you cast a spell or activate an ability, there's almost always some sort of an instance that someone, if they would like, can respond to that thing. It's just not often brought up, especially if you are a newer player. When you start getting into more advanced play, that's when you start noticing and recognizing like, well, they have untapped mana, so there can be that sort of opening of this interaction.
We're looking at this as a weakness in Magic, I think, because of that communication gap, first and foremost, because of that sort of knowledge gap in the player base.
Yeah, it's a little bit different because it's something that we talk about fairly often when we talk about games, usually as a criticism, which is that oftentimes when we talk about a specific mechanic that ends up being treated differently within the system, that can sort of feel almost like a Band-Aid, right? And that you could look at instant speed interactions in Magic as a sort of a Band-Aid, potentially. I don't know how it was developed over time when they were making the game, but seeing the potential issue of, oh, I wish that I could do something on my opponent's turn, or I wanted to stop them sooner, and I felt like I didn't have the opportunity.
Interrupt them.
oftentimes it's a designer's instinct to say, okay, well, either I'm going to have something in the system that allows for this, and that technically was what happened with the stack. But prior to the stack being developed and formalized, it was just knowing that, well, you can have instant spells. And those instant spells will allow for more of that interaction.
Right. And the stack was not in the initial rules of the game. This was something that was developed later to handle this sort of system, right? To make the system more robust. Okay, so the other sort of, I think, weakness here in Magic's interaction system and its interaction gap is that only a subset of cards get to operate at instant speed. And I think this is both a pro and a con, right? Because if you only have a subset of cards that can do this, that helps sort of chunk the information for players as to what your opponent is able to do in response to what you're doing. But if the flip side of that coin is that there's only a handful of things that actually get to interact at a certain point. And as we see in Magic systems, when formats become very powerful and the sub games become very concentrated in terms of like one turn kills, basically. If you can win the game in one sub game, there's a very small set of cards that can actually do anything about that.
Shout outs to Yu-Gi-Oh!
Yeah, and in Magic, it's basically counterspells, which means that at the highest levels of the game, when you're pushing the systems to their most extreme and you're playing the most the most powerful cards and most powerful interactions, counterspells are almost a requirement. And the flip side of that, too, is that counterspells are also the only thing that interacts with counterspells. There's a sort of cascading consequence here to the fact that Magic operates in sort of both of these worlds.
It's tough because what you get out of it is such a versatile experience every time you play, right? Oh, yeah. And we've played games that have less of this sort of fluctuating versatile interaction gap, because whether it's open or going to open or not creates such an interesting subgame that involves bluffing and being able to read your opponent, and it's really interesting. So there's lots of pros that come with it, but it is the biggest hurdle for, I think, players to get over.
And I see this as like a palpable frustration with players too when they're playing. Like we're playing a casual game of Commander and one person is taking way too many game actions. Like they're just like going off, doing their crazy value engines, basically what players refer to as goldfishing, where they're just playing solitaire. And if Magic systems had been built, if their interaction gap it was always smaller, it was always a single action, no one would, like, other players would be able to get to do things sooner, basically.
Yeah, it prevents this from being an issue. So let's move into alternatives to Magic's interaction gap. I think a lot of games have taken Magic and other games in history, but Magic in particular, and learned from the stack and the stack being developed, and post early Magic being able to go, okay, this is actually what's happening in the rules. There's definitely ways of streamlining that experience.
Right. Yeah. Well, the most obvious is that you can just go completely to one end of this interaction gap or the other, which is you can either have unlimited interaction, an unlimited interaction gap, or you can have a single action interaction gap.
Right. And so unlimited would be something close to like Lorcana. It's could also be termed like a volley system, basically, where it's my turn, you can't affect me, you can't do anything to me, you don't get to place any sort of actions, I get total control over what's going to happen on this turn, and then I will pass my turn, and then that person then gets complete agency over what their turn's going to be like.
Yeah, and the really beneficial part of doing a system in this way is that newer players get to experience what they sort of feel is the intended experience. They sort of operate almost in like a walled garden while they're playing their turn. They can think everything through and don't have to worry about interaction from their opponent until they pass the turn back. And the line between turns is very clear.
Right. Whereas the flip side of this, like you said, the single action is something just like chess, right? Where no matter what the game is like, I can only move one piece, meaning I'm only going to give one tiny bit of information to my opponent for them to be able to respond to and then make their own action.
And the single action interaction gap creates a lot of anxiety in players, right? There's a percentage of players that really do not like playing games that have that that constant interaction, right? You don't have a point in time where you can go, okay, I know I can just play my cards, right? I can just do my thing and then pass it over to my opponent to do their thing.
The gravity that it puts on every individual action becomes so heavy that it's debilitating, right? At times.
Sure. Yes. The other sort of drawback to the single action system is that it incentivizes players to take the smallest action that they possibly can in order to pass back and forth very minimal actions and then try to run your opponent out of actions so that you can then just take all of your other bigger actions.
Yeah, we see this mostly in these sort of priority passing systems. So moving away from chess, this would be something closer to like anyone that's played Artifact or that's played Legends of Runeterra is probably familiar with this, where you have, you technically do have a certain amount of interactions that you can do in a particular round, but a priority is passed between you and your opponent, meaning you and your opponent can both play cards to a finite amount set usually by some sort of mana or something. And so, like you said, it just incentivizes you to basically do the most minimal action possible until you're baiting your opponent to commit and play their large thing so that you know whether you can safely play your large thing or something to interact and prevent their thing.
And we see this dynamic emerge in Magic too, right? This is, I'm going to like play something that I don't care about as much to try to bait out a counterspell, to try to get the interaction out of my opponent's hand so then I can play the things I actually wanted to play, which is a very high skill dynamic that a lot of players like. Sam Pearson in his video talks about this type of activation system specifically with the game that he worked on with Games Workshop, and he was basically saying that, you know, in the game, especially in like a war game where you have all of your pieces on the board, you end up in weird situations where an army might be made up of a lot of sort of fodder units to basically eliminate your or like run your opponent out of activation so that you get to do the rest of your stuff. So let's say you had one side has 5 units, the other side has 15. The other side with 15 is going to activate your 5 worst units first, and then the other player is going to have to activate their 5 units, and then they're out of activations, and now you get to just act with the rest of your 10 units, effectively.
With as much known information as possible for you to get the benefit of it.
Yeah. You get to have all of your opponent's input into your subgame before you start to activate the rest of your units, which is this is a problem, right? It basically ends up reverting it to, instead of it being a one action to that dynamic up until I get to just take all the actions.
And it's like you said, is that it's especially a problem in wargaming where all of the information is known, right?
And also all of your units are on the table. Yeah.
Right. As opposed to in a card game, oftentimes that you feel like you get a little bit more versatile of an interaction because there's a lot more unknown information. You don't know what the possibilities of what your opponent can do is.
Right. And also this system is able to be worked around. Like you can change the way that units get activated. He has a bunch of examples of how he sort of designed around this. So watch his video. We're going to just touch on a couple other interaction gaps. One of them is a batch interaction system where instead of it being fully unlimited actions before your opponent gets to do anything, or a single action before your opponent gets to do something, it's somewhere in the middle where it says, I'm going to choose a batch of my actions and I'm going to be able to do all of those actions before I pass back, but it's not the totality of the actions that I would take.
As opposed to it being sort of a set variable, right? Or just having like the total possibility of whatever your actions are going to be. It's a little bit more variance to it. A good example of this, whether you're going to shout it out or not, actually, is Bullets and Teeth down here. The game that you made.
You're right. You have card types, right? Where during your turn you get to choose, okay, I'm going to play weapons, supplies, or team ups, and then you can play all of the cards that you have of that type, and then duct tape lets you switch to a new type if you have duct tape. So, but you're right. That is a batch activation system.
So the last one we're going to talk about is what we call a randomized interaction gaps. This is where the amounts of actions that you have are if they vary, right? So a good example of this might be something like Settlers of Catan, where at the start of each turn, you're rolling your dice, and that die is determining what resources you end up collecting into your hand. Those resources, how many you have in your hand, or what type of resources you collect, will determine generally the amount of actions that you can do.
And also you can trade, which is interesting.
And you can trade. And I think that a big part of why you can trade is because one of the flaws of having randomized interactions, at least in Settlers of Catan, right, is that there's a lot of potential do-nothings, right? If it's randomized and you don't have total control over it's a little weird because the resources are so directly tied to the actions in Settlers. It might be a little bit different if the resources and actions were a little bit more separated. But in Settlers of Catan case, I think that, trading was a way not only for players to be able to interact with each other a little bit more, but also to subvert this issue of having just too many do-nothing turns.
Yeah, this also comes up in games that have sort of like randomized resource generation at the beginning of the round, where let's say I don't have a game off the top of my head exactly, but let's say in Magic, when at the start of your turn, you rolled a d6, and that's how much mana you got for that turn. A system that works that way would also be a randomized interaction gap.
Machikoro. Yeah. Sure. I don't know how many people are going to know about Machikoro, but they should. It's a great game.
Another drawback from randomized interaction gaps is that sometimes that interaction gap could be almost nothing, and you feel like you're not really able to play the game, and it wasn't up to you at all. It was random. So
yeah, if I were to guess, it's probably going to favor games that lean a little bit more on the casual side. As well. So.
Well, and again, Catan has a pretty interesting solve for this, which is that you can trade. So if you get resource cards that you can't really actively use, you can trade them with someone else, and then you get to have activations on your turn. So what are some takeaways?
I think you had mentioned in Sam Pearson's video that he had brought up that the game, your specific game's resource management system and its action system is what's going to determine how that game feels overall. And that's something that you and I have talked about a lot, is that narratively and how the experience that the players will have with your game is so strongly determined based off of this, because if the game is zeros and ones, which every game underlying is technically that, how you are acquiring your zeros and ones is very indicative of what that experience and story is that players are going to be going through.
He's operating under that war game framework, and the way he described this was, being able to activate basically your entire army before your opponent does feels much more like a strategic game. It feels, it sort of harkens back to like Kriegspiel, right? Where like you're moving your entire army, although Kriegspiel you sort of play simultaneously because there's a referee, but whatever. In Warhammer, you'll move your whole army. And then if it's a single activation, it feels more tactical. It feels like each individual action matters a lot more, and you can sort of respond in real time. And it almost feels like the game is zoomed in, right, on like a specific battalion, a specific squad or something. To sort of come back to Magic, do we think that this is Magic's, I guess, greatest weakness, is that its interaction system has some additional baggage that it may or may not actually be necessary.
I don't know if it's its greatest weakness, but I do think that it is pretty telling, seeing that Richard Garfield, when he has moved on to making other games, has not had a similar system like this. I think he learned a lot from Magic and having to get so hyper specific with the rule set that he realized that moving forward, if he's going to develop a game, it's better to solve these things and how it functions sooner, so that you can better plan when players' interaction gap is going to be, initiated.
Yeah, I do think, as far as modern games go, that have innovated on, sort of Magic's interaction system. A lot of them have either moved in one direction or the other. If they're trying to attract a more casual audience, they move towards that unlimited interaction gap. And if they're trying to attract a more tactical audience, they move towards the single interaction gap. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that both of those feel, in a card game space, single action interaction gap feels more tactical. And it's essentially like playing Magic as if everything was just on the stack and could be played at instant speed. And I think its biggest appeal is that infinite combos are much like they basically just don't really happen. They can if you sort of like have a system where you can like run out of actions and then your opponent can just do whatever they want. That's a possibility. But there's just a lot more system tools in place to avoid that problem. And you don't have to like create a subset of cards that's basically the only answer to preventing that problem, like Magic has with counterspells.
If you enjoyed listening to us talk about interaction gaps in games, please feel free to give us a little like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below.
Also, we want to continue the conversation. You can join our Discord. Link is in the description. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Dairy big problems. Huge dairy big problems, and it's pizza related.
Is this Magic's biggest problem? Pizza lands.
Pizza lands. We're fed up, and it's just us full. It's like pizza.